and the geoeconomics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the world was like just before COVID, what's happened during COVID, and possibly what might happen afterwards. Because as Vignesh mentioned, this is a time of incredible change, and it could be change for the better with any luck, but it's not going to be easy to get there. So just to give you a bit of an overview, I've been working on a project for the last year. My region of specialty is the Indo-Pacific, which goes largely from kind of the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the US. From a defense perspective, the key countries in there are, of course, India, US, Japan, and Australia. We're doing a project where we went to 6 countries that are implicated in the Indo-Pacific. So apart from those, we also went to the UK because post-Brexit they have some rather grand ambitions, or at least they say they do, and France, which has territories in the Indo-Pacific region, the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean. And we held roundtables with the strategic communities, and this is all just before COVID, so it's quite useful as a benchmark for what people were thinking then. This is kind of, you know, the end of 2019. And what we saw was that there were kind of 3 constants in that we kept hearing in the strategic community. One was there was quite a lot of domestic uncertainty. You know, so people didn't really know where things would go. In the US, there's the big question about, you know, the 2020 election. In the UK, it's Brexit. In France, it's the direction of the EU. In Japan, it's the post-Abe era. So there's a lot of kind of just, you know, uncertainty, and that uncertainty was made worse by internal divisions. And this is particularly in the context of what to do about China. So people in the economic sphere and to a certain degree the political sphere tended to be much more about engagement with China, rapprochement, all that sort of stuff, as much as you can. But people in the defense, security, intelligence communities were very much on guard. You know, we have a problem, and so that division about how to deal with China was very, very evident. And the result was that a lot of countries that aren't the US were hedging. And you know, India is one of them, where, you know, we're going to have a good economic relationship with China, but we're going to have a strategic relationship with the US. So those factors, that kind of the uncertainty, the division, and the hedging, were very present heading into COVID. What happened during COVID was China seemed to think that this was a good opportunity to advance its economic and strategic agendas in ways that were rather stunning. I mean, I don't have to tell you in India about what happened on the border, but if you look around at what it did at the same time. So this is kind of, we're going to go through a little list of stuff, and this is stuff that's just happened since the beginning of the year. So especially since COVID really kind of locked everybody down and crashed people's economies and paralyzed political decision making. So they did so many things. I have to have an actual list. You know, there is a Chinese Coast Guard ship rammed and sank a Vietnamese fishing ship. But the Chinese Navy locked its fire control on a Philippines Navy ship. Other Chinese ships harassed Malaysian survey ships in what Malaysia says were, in fact, are Malaysian waters. Chinese fishing boats moved into Indonesian waters. Another Chinese fishing boat, and these fishing boats, you know, they're kind of gray-hulled. They're not. They might fish, but they seem to also be a component of Chinese state power. Rammed another one of those rammed a Japanese maritime self-defense force destroyer. And then there's the incredible language around Taiwan. The usual terminology around Taiwan is, you know, they want peaceful reunification with Taiwan, and the premier dropped the word peaceful, and they've been running very large exercises that are overtly designed to emulate an invasion of Taiwan. So that's just what they've been doing in the sea area. Economically, one of the things they've been doing is They launched and are trialing within China a new electronic currency. It would be the first state-backed electronic currency. And part of the goal seems to be to try to figure out how to dislodge the U.S. dollars, the global reserve currency, and it's possible that they're going to present it as being backed by gold. I'm not sure whether it'll work or not, but that same level of disruption they're trying to do in the international currency market. And of course, as countries' economies are being destroyed by the lockdown, there is also an attempt to buy up assets around the world, especially strategic assets. This is something the Indian government identified early on and put in place the FDI regulations, looking at restricting access from, or monitoring access from investment from border countries, which of course isn't Bhutan, right? I mean, that's India. At the same time, China is using all sorts of legal and tariff mechanisms to harry partners. So one of them was putting tariffs on the Australian stuff. When Australia said, look, can we please just do an inquiry and find out a little bit more about the origin of COVID? China said, I don't think so. And in fact, we're going to put, huge tariffs on your barley. And the biggest one in that context, the biggest legal change that they pushed through was the state security legislation having to do with Hong Kong, which is a complete tragedy. I mean, what's going on in Hong Kong is heartbreaking. And of course, there's what happened in Galwan. So this is the actions on the part of China have been so overt and so condensed. It feels like they had plans for a lot of this kind of stuff, and then because of the opening offered by the paralysis on the part of other countries. For example, very early on, one of the U.S. carriers was pulled back to port because of a COVID situation on the ship. China has a habit of trying to use these potential openings, as they did in '62, to push really fast. And it feels like that's what they did. They accelerated and deepened the timeline for a lot of things that they already had in mind. Not in all cases, but in some cases, that seems to be what's happened. The result has been that the populations around the world who were already not delighted at what the virus was doing to them economically, but also in many cases at a very personal level. You can't see your family, people are passing away, it's, your life stops. And it was very clear that, this came from China, but also had the Chinese Communist Party acted differently earlier on, a lot of people think, the effect would have been limited. So already there wasn't a lot of popular sympathy for the Chinese Communist Party, and then you see this ramping up of aggressive action all over the place. And so you get the kind of pushback that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago when I originally talked to all of those people at the roundtables. The U.S. brought in the Defense Procurement Act. India banned the apps, which is genius. I mean, it was an extremely smart move. The banning of the apps helps. First of all, hopefully it's just the beginning, but it helps enormously with espionage, with blocking Chinese access to personal data, but also to location tracking, which can be useful for troop movement, but also for getting advantage in industrial espionage. It also limits their access to vast amounts of metadata, which the Chinese are counting on to develop their advanced AI weaponry. It kicks the valuation of some of the Chinese companies quite hard. So ByteDance, which owns TikTok, Global Times itself estimated that there was that the Indian ban might cause it $6 billion. So the financial impact is very high, and also it gives room to Indian developers to take over some of those spaces and create applications not just for the Indian market, but then could be extended to the rest of the world, who are also looking for non-Chinese products. And the other thing is that it's something that can be done fast. It can be done within a matter of weeks. So unlike taking Huawei out of your system, which can take years, this can be done very fast. So that was an example of a very smart pushback that becomes justified based on the actions that China took. Now, that would have been kind of harder to do 6 months ago. And Secretary of State Pompeo and President Trump are looking at emulating that move. Similarly, what happened with Hong Kong, caused Secretary of State Pompeo to certify to Congress that Hong Kong is no longer independent of China, and that'll give it a lot of economic levers. What's happening essentially is China talks a lot about its comprehensive power. So the combination of military, diplomacy, economy, as a package, as a way of achieving the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. And now what we're starting to see is a comprehensive defense. So a defense that isn't just military, but it's also economic, like you see with the apps. It's also legislative, like you're seeing with Hong Kong. So the pushback is starting to be much more varied and much more effective. So the question is, where does this potentially go from here? And I'm hoping, and we're starting to see signs of this, that what it'll do is it will help to create a new era of alliances. It's dealt with the three things that I talked about initially, this kind of uncertainty, the internal divisions and the hedging. Because countries need to deal with this, in terms of, for example, uncertainty, there may be uncertainty about who wins the US election. But I think because of the popular sentiment, there's no more uncertainty about how the population feels about China. And so whether it's a Democrat or a Republican who comes in, there's going to be a lot of public support, which is helpful in a democracy, to deal with China. So that uncertainty gets mitigated. In terms of internal divisions, the voices that were talking about doing more business with China are being drowned out now by the voices that are saying this has been very problematic for us, and this has really not helped us in any way economically or otherwise. Maybe a few individuals have gotten rich, but as a country we've been decimated. And so the hedging is reducing. And you see that in India very clearly. There's much more willingness to think about alliances within the Quad or with the US, things like that. So that's been the big change. Like when I talked to people in October, they thought maybe we'd get to the end of hedging by 2024, but it looks like we're getting to the end of hedging a lot faster if this keeps up the way it is. And so what you're seeing are things like Prime Minister Modi having a virtual summit with Prime Minister Morrison in Australia, and signing some defense logistics agreements, but also saying things like, we'll buy some of that barley that you can't sell to China anymore. So building some of those comprehensive defensive mechanisms into those alliances. One of the big concerns early on in the research was what would happen with the City of London, because the assumption was that the City of London would push very hard for China, because they want to be, after Brexit, they want to be an international financial center, and they saw money coming from China to help support that, especially potentially around internationalizing the Chinese currency. With Hong Kong, I think the strategy has changed now, because they're offering the British passport holders, British nationals overseas, passport holders, to come and settle in the UK. potentially up to 3 million of them. I suspect what they're trying to do is get the Hong Kong money instead of the Beijing money. So if they do that, and if that's successful, then the UK shifts quite rapidly from being kind of soft on China to potentially being, the home of a Hong Kong government in exile. So that's where the geoeconomics and the geopolitics come in quite closely. The most, the Huawei situation is very problematic. And again, UK 6 months ago was talking about what to do with Huawei and its systems. And now the UK government has said, why don't we form a D10, D for democracy, and 10 for the countries that would be involved. So that would be the G7 plus India, Australia, and South Korea to develop a 5G system that would compete with Huawei. So again, kind of new forms of alliances based on we're not going to hedge anymore, we're going to start to solve these problems. The most interesting idea along these lines that I've heard actually has come out of India, which is the idea for an Indo-Pacific charter. So in 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill signed a charter with 8 points on it, which was what they wanted the world to look like after the end of what would become the Second World War. The U.S. hadn't even joined the war at that point, but they knew that they were probably going to, and they wanted to be able to say what were they fighting for. They knew what they were fighting against. They were fighting, against Nazism and Imperial Japan, but what were they fighting for? And it was things like, self-determinations for populations, which was very relevant for India, democracy, market economics, those sorts of things. And it laid the foundation for the United Nations later on. And now the proposal coming out of some Indian thinkers is for an Indo-Pacific charter. So to bring countries together based on a common vision for how they would like the world to be framed. It's not explicitly against China, but when you take a look at some of the points, like countries that are democracies stay democracies, which would mean Taiwan, you can see the direction it's heading. So we've gone in a very, very short period of time, 7 or 8 months, we've gone through geopolitical and geoeconomic realignment that under normal circumstances might take years, and in some cases might not even ever happen if there wouldn't have been this COVID-19 crisis. So it's an interesting time to be looking at these things, and I'm very, very glad that COVINTS is and Manipal is and PRISM is. So thank you very much for having me. I look forward to your questions.
Cleo, in fact, a lot of what we would discuss going forward in terms of how the economics of the whole climate change debate shapes out. I mean, geopolitics, and we should not forget that geopolitics and this geoeconomics is at the heart of such a debate, and that will actually determine the shape of policy and how it moves towards shaping this economy. So as we always do, we will just put out a poll in terms of understanding what the audience would be interested in leading the discussion from your side. So I would just request the audience to just take this poll. This is a question which Cleo has provided, and based on your answers, we would actually start our discussion with Cleo after the end of the next session with that particular topic or the area. So our question basically is, what are the likely implications of COVID-19 pandemic for the geophysical, geoeconomic, and geopolitical dynamics in specific regions in the next 1 year? So I would just request our participants to take this poll so that we can have a good interactive session. As we see, because once it's shifted to an online webinar format, having the interaction levels, this is the best way forward, is what we think. So I think it's interesting, and I think it's more or less like you had predicted. So the answer at the beginning of this session, we just give it another maybe a minute or so until we get at least past the 50%, so that we know which region we are sticking with. Okay, I think yes, I think the highest, I think the answer is for the Middle East and or West Asia as we call it. So I think we will go forward with that. So Cleo will take this as the leading question once we start the discussion after Ulka has presented. So thank you so much, Cleo. And now I would just invite Ulka to make her presentation. Ulka, I'll just share your presentation right now on the screen. If that is fine, thank you. Yes. Yes, Ulka, can you hear me? I'm unable to hear. Yeah.
Are you able to hear me, Vignesh?
Yes, pretty well. I mean,
Yes.
pretty good. Yes, yes. Thank you. Please go ahead.
I'm afraid I'm not able to hear you, Vignesh. So if you could just keep your video on and maybe give me a visual signal that I can go ahead.
Yes, please. Yes, Ulka, you can please go ahead. Yeah.
Um,
Can you see the presentation on the screen?
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Dhanashree, for that message. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak in this very interesting topic. I'm going to just present a few slides. They're not very technical, they're mostly photographs by way of background. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. I think we've all been attending a lot of webinars, and I'd like to just take a step back to how it was before the coronavirus crisis hit us. And if you look at the multilateral approach that we had for climate change, the idea behind it was that every country must have a consensus on almost every word in the text on climate change. So someone said that it's like organizing a party for 200 friends, but there's a single menu that everybody has to eat. You don't get a choice. So that's really been the basis of climate action so far. Could you go to the next slide, please? The other dimension of the tension over climate change action has been that between the United States and China, the two biggest emitters. And if you can see the text over here, it says that the entire tension is defined by one theme, which is that any action that the US commits to, China must be bound by the same conditions. So this has been really the underlying, sort of battle, and eventually we had the Paris Agreement, where every country, voluntarily put forward its climate action. If you could go to the next slide, please. The other business trend, or let me say financial trend, that has been happening outside the political negotiations is one where more and more companies have been disclosing their investments in fossil fuels, in sectors or in projects which might get affected by climate change, or which might get affected by regulation on climate change. So this is what is called carbon disclosure or climate related disclosure. The other thing that has been happening is that a lot of funding, a lot of funds, whether they are multilateral development banks, or whether they are sovereign wealth funds or pension funds, or like organizations like the World Bank, have been divesting successively from fossil fuels. So for example, the World Bank announced in around 2013 that it would stop funding fossil fuels unless it was absolutely part of the country's strategy. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which itself was built on oil and gas money, said that it would no longer fund upstream oil recovery or oil refining. And then most recently, the Japanese banks, which have been the last sort of big funders of coal projects, coal mining, have also announced recently they're under tremendous pressure from their investors to withdraw from coal mining. So what is being created, even as India doubles down on its coal-based power, which of course is something that is essential and important for our energy security and for our energy access, is that if we don't take a very balanced view and a long-term view of this, we might end up creating stranded assets. That is, assets which become non-performing assets for the banks that invest in them. And unless we upskill the workers from these projects, we may be putting them in a kind of sunset industry rather than the sunrise industry. If you could go to the next slide, please. Another way of looking at business risk is this picture is taken from the California wildfires, where the electricity company PG&E was held responsible for not taking proactive measures around climate change and the increased risk of wildfires. For example, they could have buried the electricity lines underground, or they could have taken measures to lop off the dry branches of the trees. And so PG&E became what was called the first corporate casualty of climate change. And they had to declare bankruptcy preemptively in order to avoid these liabilities. If you could go to the next slide, please. Another aspect that I wanted to talk about was really China's muscle on the Belt and Road Initiative, where if you look at the entire set of investments in the energy sector, the bulk of it is continued to be in fossil fuels, and only 13% of this was in renewable energy. So if that 13% could become 25%, it would be equivalent to what all the multilateral development banks are putting in clean energy. So this is really a very big, very powerful source of investment, which is driving whether the energy sector of the future, the energy mix of the future is clean, is green or brown. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then, of course, coronavirus hit us in a very big way, and a lot of things changed overnight. So I wanted to actually pose the next poll question at this point, the first poll question, if you could do that. Do you think the coronavirus crisis will increase or accelerate action on climate change and sustainability? Or do you think it will act as a speed breaker or a roadblock to action on climate change and sustainability? Just be curious to hear the opinion of the participants. I think the organizers will keep the poll there for some time, and do let me know when to go ahead.
Option which is there. So
great. I can hear you now, Vignesh, so that's very good.
That's fantastic. So I think you should be able to see the result of the poll on your screen right now.
76% are pessimistic about climate action getting accelerated, even though we've been quite nostalgic about clear skies and so on. Right?
Yeah, that's the total number of those who have voted right now. About 47% roughly say that it will act as a speed breaker to action on climate change and sustainability.
Okay.
So would you like to address it at this point, or we can just move ahead and you can address it at the end of your talk?
No, I think this is a very interesting kind of snapshot of feelings right now, where I think this is being reflected even in policy, where people feel that we have an immediate crisis, it's a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, and maybe nature and environment sort of comes later. So I'm going to try in the next few slides to convince the participants, the attendees otherwise. But if you could just go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things happening because of climate change, and many of you may have been seeing the very alarming headlines out of Siberia and the Arctic Circle about how there's been unprecedented warming. You know, Siberia was warmer than India at that point of time. One of the implications of this is that ice or snow-covered ground that was permanently frosted over, what was called permafrost, is now melted. And there are two consequences of this. One is that a lot of viruses and pathogens that were buried for decades or even centuries could now be released. These are what are being called the zombie diseases of climate change. And we neither have immunity against these diseases, nor do we have a ready-made cure. But the other sort of opportunistic consequence of this permafrost melt has been that for Greenland, for example, it has become now possible to mine a lot of rare earth minerals that are available to them under the land. So as with a lot of, as with any crisis, there's always a cost and there's always an opportunity. And it depends on what kind of view we want to take. So if you could just move on to the next slide. The other development that happened was that a swarm of locusts came towards India. I think this was a lot on Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp. And this is not actually something new as such. These swarms of locusts do originate in Africa every year. They are stopped around, in the vicinity of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Rajasthan every year. One thing that was different last year was that the monsoon in India took a longer time to retreat. So it was a much more prolonged monsoon, and we had damp conditions which prevailed for much longer and which provided a fertile source of, for the locusts to come and breed. It was sort of unseasonal. So that's one way in which we attracted these locusts, which would not normally have happened. And the other is that the kind of spraying and mitigation measures that would have happened normally couldn't happen because of the lockdown. So one of the lessons that I take away from the coronavirus crisis is that it is a convergence of crises. We have things that are happening in the economy, in health, and in nature, which can no longer be treated separately. They're all very, very closely interconnected. Next slide, please. Another example of the interconnections, the spatial interconnections of our economies. This is an example from flooding in Thailand, which happened in 2011 end, where suddenly we woke up to the fact that almost half the hard drives in the world were made in Thailand. And when this severe flooding happened, it affected the supply chains of big companies like Sony and Intel. And in fact, for that quarter, Japan's economy was depressed by about 2%. So this is an example of how we are highly globalized. And if you could just go to the next slide. It's a sort of precursor to the kind of choices that we are making right now, that in fact every country is making for itself. Do we choose to hedge our risks? Do we choose to diversify supply chains? Or do we choose to become more inward looking? Do we choose to be more cooperative, or do we choose to become more competitive? And here the example that I'm giving is that of solar power, which of course for India, we are using it very much as a source of demonstrating our climate leadership to the world. You would know that this is very much part and parcel of India's nationally determined contribution, but we are also hosting the International Solar Alliance. And as a result, we are providing, the state is providing the muscle and the backing to, through say credit guarantees, to a lot of extremely, maybe the biggest ever solar parks in the world. And it has a number of consequences. Of course, solar power has become cheap, so it's a good way for our country to get relatively cheap electricity. But there are other implications also which are a little bit glossed over. One is that it's a very land-intensive source of power. So the people who lease their lands for these kinds of solar parks, um, those who own lands may still get something out of it, but the landless laborers who used to work on this land, or the pastoralist farmers whose livelihoods depended on this land, do not even get consulted. Solar power, being renewable energy, is considered to be inherently benign, inherently good, so it is actually not subject to social or environmental impact assessments by the law of the country. So that is one problem. The other is the biodiversity itself. That is, what is actually a very rich ecosystem of grasslands is, in some sense, treated as wasteland or barren land, and is given over to these projects. So increasingly in the climate change discourse, we are talking about something called just transition. That is, the low carbon energy transition also needs to be just and fair, and this is how the economic and security discourses really come together. The next slide, which is the map of power and water, this actually shows you where India's thermal power plants are located. And those are the black dots that you see. And most of them require water for cooling. And this is usually fresh water. Very few thermal power plants in India use recycled water or seawater. And the dark patches that you see are the areas which are already facing acute water stress. So this is one dimension of security which is affected by the risks of climate change, which we don't normally consider, which is that these power plants are often shut down as a result of water shortage. So many different aspects need to be looked at. So solar power plants do fare much better than thermal power plants in respect of water use. Could you go to the next slide? For India, I think the coronavirus has really revealed or exposed the vulnerability of our economy because it's so highly dependent on the informal sector and how workers who work in this informal sector. This is an example of a silk reeling unit very close to where I stay in Bangalore. And the workers here lack formal safety nets. So any kind of measures that we take, I think now need to be extremely responsive to the previously invisible part of our economy. Next slide, please. And this is really my last kind of pictorial depiction, which is that even as we invest in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, we need to think of security of supply chains in a circular fashion. That is, not only the resources that will be required for these new technologies, but even what happens next. How are they disposed of? How are they recycled? And this is important not just from an environmental perspective, but also from the perspective of security, of energy security. Because if you look at, and Cleo has, I think, referred to this, is that the kinds of rare earth minerals that we are dependent on are not found in India. So there is definitely a need to look at, to invest in research and development on battery chemistries and other technologies which are more suited to our conditions, the climate, for example, and also our natural resources. So this was just a string of examples to show how things are interlinked, how there are always dynamic implications of looking at vulnerability and risk, and how we need to plan in a more long-term manner. So I think this is a good time to go to poll question 2. If you could just display that, please. So my question is, do you think that after this COVID-19 crisis is over, countries will be more cooperative on climate action, or do you think they will be more competitive and take independent measures on climate action? Is it every country for itself, or is there still a role for multilateral action?
So, in fact, when you were reading out the question, I just saw that people had already started looking for it. So that's a good sign, and let us see what the outcome is basically for this one. We'll just keep it on for another few seconds.
Sure.
This one is the outcome is quite interesting because it's almost close to each other in terms of the result. I just urge the audience to take this poll. It will give us a good, also help us with having a good discussion on these topics apart from the questions which have been posed. Okay, I think the majority of the answers are poised towards again the second option. There'd be more competition and they would take independent measures on climate action.
Well, thank you to everyone who participated in the poll. It's very interesting to see your views, and I think you're actually very much on the right track. We hope that there would be more cooperation, but certainly at the moment it looks otherwise. So. So in the next few slides, I want to if you could just go to the next slide, I want to give you a very quick summary of what recent global action on the green economic recovery is looking like. So the next slide, please. So right now, it's quite a huge amount of money that is being invested in the post-COVID economic recovery. I think something like $3 trillion are being invested by different countries. The bulk of it is, of course, coming in United States, Japan, EU, Germany. Next slide, please. And about a third of this stimulus package has relevance for environmental issues. So things like agriculture, energy efficiency, renewable energy, public transport. So that's a kind of a measure of how much is being invested in kind of potentially clean and green measures. It would also include, for example, tree planting and nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So one study interviewed a large number of experts to try to ask them to identify what would be the most, the best stimulus measures. So on the vertical axis, you have measures which would have a high climate impact, and on the horizontal axis, you have measures which would have a high economic impact, whether in terms of jobs or other kinds of multiplier effects. And I'd like to highlight four types of measures. So of course, clean energy infrastructure, building upgrades in terms of energy efficiency, then green spaces and natural spaces, and finally research and development. So these four were identified as measures which would have win-win kind of multiplier effects, both for the climate as well as for the economy. If you could go to the next slide, please. Another study has shown that actually compared to fossil fuel like oil and gas and coal, renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency generate 3 times as many jobs. So that's a kind of argument to be made for going into the future, for investing in these sectors in the future, not just in terms of the stranded assets that I talked about, but all in terms of the livelihood implications, but even in terms of basic job creation. So next slide. Unlike the energy sector, this is an example from the transportation sector, where if you see the kinds of jobs that would be created per $1 million of investments, the maximum comes from pedestrian and bike lane creation or charging infrastructure. And as one of my later examples will show, China is actually making a huge investment in charging infrastructure. And then, for example, manufacturing battery-operated electric vehicles is less labor-intensive. But if you combine battery manufacturing and car manufacturing, then it offsets the labor creation, the employment creation effect of internal combustion engines. Next slide. So I just wanted to mention a few recent initiatives. One is, for example, the big conglomerate Unilever has announced that all its 70,000 products are going to display their carbon footprint. Then there's a lot of investment in smart grid technologies because, as we invest more in renewable energy, which is intermittent, you need to have more smart balancing of demand and supply. There is also investment in what is called green hydrogen, which is that you produce hydrogen but from renewable sources, and in fact even things like using hydrogen in steel making. I mentioned China's example of building 48,000 charging stations. And there are also interesting examples of policy where, for example, California has mandated that the materials that are used for building construction should be low carbon. And the Spanish government has entered into a deal with coal mining unions, where they said that though we will close the coal mines, we will use a certain amount of money, we'll keep it aside for people who worked in these coal mines to set up new businesses or to restore the land around these deactivated mines. Next slide, please. So with that, I think this is just the last part of my presentation where I wanted to share some of the work that we have been doing for India. And this is an open access model called the Energy Policy Simulator. It's on the web. You're welcome to just have a look at it. Could you just show the next slide? And the question that we are trying to answer through this model is, what if you chose a package of policies? Pick good policies in the energy sector, in the transport sector, in, say, tree plantation. Have cross-cutting policies, like, for example, a small carbon tax on fossil fuel use. And the black line shows you what would be India's greenhouse gas emissions if we were to not take any of these measures. And the green line shows you what would it take to flatten the curve. I mean, now we are very familiar with the flattening the curve concept. So this is not the coronavirus curve, this is the emissions, the carbon emissions curve. And the little dip that you see in 2020, 21 is the current impact of the coronavirus lockdown and the economic recession. So as you can see, it's just a temporary dip. It's not going to have any long-term impacts unless we make significant policy changes and investment changes. Otherwise, the black line will continue, business as usual, going well beyond India's NDC target. And the green line shows you what is it that needs to be done. Next slide. I'm going to try to break this up a little bit and show the same thing to you in terms of pollutants that are not carbon dioxide, but which are the kinds of pollutants that affect our health directly. And if you see over here that if we take the same set of measures that are good for the climate, you will also end up saving nearly 1 lakh lives in 10 years. So this curve is in the form of human lives saved as a result of the reduced air pollution. Next slide, please. And I think that's the last slide. And this is really trying to show you if you look at the different types of measures that are required, some measures, which are on the left-hand side, pay for themselves. They don't cost as much. They don't require anything special only for the sake of climate benefits or health benefits. They are, they make business sense in themselves. So for example, vehicle fuel efficiency standards or industrial energy efficiency. The energy efficiency and the electricity saved or the fuel saved pays for itself in terms of lower costs. But if you look at that very long, thin, magenta colored line, that is a carbon tax. So a carbon tax would be something like an additional cess on the use of coal or oil and gas. And although it would cost very little to the economy, it would have a very large, so that's why it's so wide and flat, it would have a lot of impact in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. Now, the tricky thing with the carbon tax is who pays for it. So if the costs are getting passed on to consumers, then the revenues from the carbon tax have to be recycled back to those that need it the most, either through an investment fund or through a direct subsidy. So I think that's really the last slide that I have. You could just go on to the next slide. And I'll just try to summarize and ask these questions. Could you just go to the next slide, please? I think that's the last one, right? Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to summarize that, that I found actually, looking at this issue of climate crisis and coronavirus, the pandemic through the lens of geoeconomics and geopolitics, it's very helpful because not only are there very clear spatial connections, but the kinds of, policies that we are implementing, that India is implementing in response to the climate crisis are also going to, I mean, we also hope we hope to position ourselves as a climate leader. But if we really commit to some of these measures, whether it is on renewable energy or electric vehicles or nature-based solutions, then we would also create the kinds of resilient jobs and economies that are required for the next few decades. So I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for your time and patience.
Thank you so much, Ulka. That was a fascinating presentation. In fact, it just captured the absolute essence of what we were trying to also see, apart from the larger debate on geopolitics and geoeconomics, which Cleo also touched upon. And if I can also request Cleo to come on the screen, then we can take the questions. There are quite a few questions actually, and because of the presentations, our audience have a lot of questions. And so the first question I would like to pose, I think that question is quite open to both of you to answer, because it's not been indicated to whom. But the question is, COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world drastically, at least with the thinking narrative of every nation. The pandemic is growing exponentially on one side while nations are engaged in a power tussle on the other side. In a situation like this, what are the actual cost and benefit outcomes? So this question is a little broad. So if you would like to also touch upon some specific areas, you're free to do that as well. Yeah, anyone can take this.
Yeah, it's a difficult. I think the way it's framed, it's a bit difficult. If I could maybe narrow it down to the specific example of, say, solar power,
Sure.
right? One of the ways in which the Indian government is trying to um, implement the green stimulus is by, one of the things that happened was energy demand dipped in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown. So there wasn't as much demand for renewable energy. And a lot of the projects that were in the implementation phase, they got stuck as well, right? I mean, the construction of the project stopped. So the entire financial calculations of these kinds of projects got complicated. So the way that they decided to respond to this was to bring back import tariff duties. Because, for example, most of our components come from China and Southeast Asia. So it was an essentially kind of inward-looking import substitution kind of approach, where we want to substitute these with domestic manufacturing, and we hope that that domestic manufacturing will give a long-term boost to jobs and to our MSMEs as well. But this is not something that happens overnight, so it's a little complicated. But I think that's the kind of response that has happened, and immediately close on the heels of that has come this military tension. So it all kind of plays into each other. So I don't have an answer there except to sort of show what kinds of imperatives really come into play. I don't know if Cleo has an example from another part of the world.
Yeah, probably Cleo can also answer the poll question and her thoughts on that, along
Okay.
with this. Yeah.
Well, first of all, okay, your presentation was very interesting. Thank you very much. I learned a lot, and it's very important way of framing. So in terms of cost benefit, so obviously it depends on for whom. So I'm going to pick India as to do the evaluation for. I think India has nothing is set yet. We're in motion, but if India continues on the track that it's continuing on, I think this could benefit India enormously in many, many ways. I mean, economically, some of the ways that Ulka's talking about in terms of creating domestic industry around renewables or that sort of stuff, but also in terms of apps, because I can tell you that the very large economies are looking to shift supply chains out of China, and there's money coming out of the U.S. government to do it. And it, you know, some of it will be onshored, but a lot of it will stay in the region. So there, economically, there's a big opening for India, and geopolitically, there's a big opening for India because, you know, there's a desire for leadership, and this comes a little bit to the question, you know, what does it mean for the Middle East? The Middle East is, or West Asia, and even just the difference in terminology is very telling. It has extreme challenges, and a core of that is going to again be what was talked about in Ulka's presentation in terms of kind of what kind of energy systems we end up with, because if fossil fuel prices crash, continue to stay low, that's going to have an economic effect, which is going to affect unemployment, which is going to affect stability, which is, you know, not a great thing. I mean, and from an Indian perspective, it means you'll probably get a lot of people coming back to India. You won't see the millions that are working there now. There's a whole ideological component to it, and there's a potential for the need for troops on the ground. Now, this is something that India has talked about itself. You know, U.S. troops are very expensive. You know, maybe if you need stability in Saudi, it might be an issue for India. But then there's a question of the kind of the China and the Russia angle within West Asia. So if Saudi ends up buying the S-400 system, and if India goes through with its deal, then basically you can't have high tech military cooperation with the U.S. anymore. So things are moving very quickly. I would say that it's very difficult in terms of the West Asia situation to, it's very easy to imagine a lot of things that can go wrong. It's a lot harder to imagine things that can go right, and that would create more stability within the region. So I don't know which way it's going to go, but hopefully my imagination is insufficient for the correct positive answer.
No, most of the times, if we predict something, the world has different plans for us. So that does happen most of the times. So
hope so.
In terms of there are a few questions. I just clubbed this because they fall under the similar bracket. And what is basically the I think Ulka would also be able to give her inputs since she has worked on SARC. What is the potential for climate change cooperation in South Asia, and keeping the whole geo-economic and the geopolitical scenario right now after COVID? Where does that place South Asia? Because we have repeatedly seen that SARC has not been very effective in terms of dealing with many issues in the region. And India also lately has been looking at an alternative mechanism, either through BIMSTEC or others, to take forward all different forms of cooperation, whatever leaves out Pakistan. That, to put it plainly, India is trying alternatives. So in terms of that, specifically with climate change as an issue or a solution for the climate crisis, where do you really see South Asia and cooperation within South Asia?
Thank you. So, in a sense, we are very closely linked to each other on the climate crisis. The kind of warming that we are seeing in the Himalayan region, for example, is much more than in other parts of the world. What happens in the Himalayas affects us downstream all the way to Bangladesh. So the issue of transboundary water sharing has always been a problematic one for this region, and we have not been able to really solve it. Even on, for example, things like data sharing on flood forecasting, say for flash floods. So I think there have been other regional associations that have done a much better job, but we have somehow not been able to learn from them. But I think increasingly there is these countries are seeing opportunity in the energy space. So one of the limitations, for example, that Bangladesh has is in terms of wheeling out its power, right? It doesn't have the capacity, although there's capacity to generate power, there isn't capacity to distribute it and to kind of have a kind of a regional grid, perhaps, where you would share electricity across the South Asian region. Migration is, of course, is a big challenge as well. So I think the specific question on India and Bhutan, I think I would say two highly crucial areas of cooperation. One is on ecosystems and natural resources. We share a lot of areas which are sensitive in terms of wildlife. And natural ecosystems, and the other is on water and electricity, hydropower and electricity. One of the interesting examples that had come up from Bhutan was how the cost of hydropower dams is rising because the water level in the rivers is rising as a result of glacier melt. And so you need to augment or need to add the investment cost of the hydropower projects that you had planned. So definitely there's a lot of potential, but I think some of the political factors become bottlenecks. SARC has unfortunately not strengthened itself. There were windows of opportunity for investment finance, which they have not made use of. There was talk about streamlining these processes, but that has not happened. A number of SARC centers, like the SARC Meteorological Center, were actually shut down. So you're reducing, in fact, your institutional capacity for collaboration on climate change. So no solutions there, but definitely a lot of potential. Thanks.
Cleo, you would like to give your opinion on that question, basically on South Asia and the scope for cooperation, keeping the larger geo-economic and the geopolitical conditions which have turned up after the COVID-19 pandemic has struck.
Yeah, so it's essentially to the way that I see it, kind of a deepening and an acceleration of the trends that were already there before. You see it very clearly in Nepal and what's happening in Nepal, where you've got a China-backed government, creating problems on the border with India. So again, I think that the potential for alliances is much larger than it's been at any time that I've known since the end of the Cold War. You have the U.S. has been characterized as being isolationist or whatever, but actually, if you look at the policies, the goal in the Indo-Pacific and for the region is to encourage burden sharing, as they put it. But what that means is essentially working together a lot more closely. So it doesn't necessarily mean pulling out. It means sharing the tools for everybody to do more. So there isn't the mental architecture where DC has to control everything or wants to have a piece of everything. That gives an opening for India to really start to create structures and alliances that are beneficial around the region. Now, there are a lot of domestic political issues that can be problematic in that construct, but even more, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money coming in from China and coming in from Russia who are that's trying to derail that. So the arms lobbies are extremely strong. The global economy is in a mess, and the two sectors where you can make a lot of money are the arms sector and things like nuclear power plants, very large infrastructure projects. So while at a kind of fundamental level, the logic for alliances is there are still these major spoilers which come in terms of major financial incentives to individuals to try to derail it. So it's very difficult to say which way it's going to go. But the potential for positive cooperation is very high. And there are a lot of people around the world who would like to see it happen. More and more people than there were before, and more people interested than there were before.
There was one very pertinent point which Ulka had raised in terms of moving away from our existing dependence on China. I mean, even in India, there has been a move where there's an ambitious target to move as much as possible to different areas in terms of economic production and also to produce within India. So we've probably been a long time since in India we've heard such views about self producing or make in India, of course, has been going on, but I see that there'll be a lot of push towards that. So some questions basically are there on supply chain diversification. Uh, a lot of components, and also like Ulka had pointed out on rare earths, and you had also rightly pointed out, Cleo, in terms of our dependence on China. And when we are talking about something like a new Cold War, I mean, though of course that is again quite subjective in terms of whose interpretation we're looking at. The new Cold War that we're talking about. So how do you see that the new economic conditions will be? How do we adapt, or how do countries diversify their supply chains and the economic structure? We have been dependent, or the world has been largely dependent on China after the reforms in China. So it has been quite a while. So where do you see this heading, and especially in terms of the of possible greener recovery which we can make after the COVID crisis? How do we see the role of China in terms of its position in that system?
Do you want me to go first, or do you want to? Or, yeah. So okay, so I'm just going to sum up because there's some really good questions at the sidebar, and I'm going to incorporate some of those into it.
Right.
So fundamentally, I don't see the Chinese economy as a normal economy. I see it. I wrote a piece in the Sunday Guardian newspaper last weekend. And there were quite a few pieces about China and economics, and China's now banned the India Sunday Guardian newspaper, so we may have struck a nerve. But I see that the structure is essentially parasitic. It latches on to healthy economies, figures out a way of getting in, and then leaches capital and intellectual property back to China. So it's not a normal market economy. And I think what's starting to happen is you're starting to see this economic self-defense. It started with the tariffs, with U.S. putting on the tariffs. You see it in India with the app ban. You're seeing it in Japan, talking about kind of multi-billion-dollar fund to help Japanese companies shift their supply chain out of China, their manufacturing out of China. It doesn't have to come back to Japan, but just go somewhere else. So China has, especially since joining the WTO, has kind of used and abused global economic systems in a way that is not normal. The Belt and Road Initiative that's not economics, that's strategic. So as countries start to put in place the real cost, I mean, this is something that people who've been looking at climate economics for a long time know. There's an enormous use of externalities when you look at the cost of fossil fuel versus renewables or whatever. In the same way, China has offset a lot of the costs through subsidies, through just outright payments, through bribery of their goods. So I think as the real economics start to come into play, you're going to see that countries are actually, like India, are a lot more competitive than they were before. I mean, the fundamental issue that India has had is, you can make a lot more money if you're a corrupt official. You can make a lot more money from importing an aircraft from France than producing it domestically. So there's been an incentive to do imports, or especially around high-priced items, as opposed to manufacturing it domestically. But I think that hopefully, I think you have a government in place now that is going to try to, again, shift those distorted economics. So once you get to real economics, the advantages of India become much more clear. I'm sorry to take up some time, but I just want to make sure that we address this, because another old friend of ours, Diraj, has asked a very good question about how will China respond, because now we're talking about everything that's happening in the face of China, but China's not going to sit back and say, oh, okay, we're losing all our markets and all that sort of stuff. And there's an old, there's kind of an old saying about China, which is first they try to bribe you, and then they try to bully you, and then they don't know what to do next. And that's kind of what we're seeing. The bullying is increasing, and it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to go down easily. I think you're going to see a lot more cyber attacks, electronic warfare attacks, use of proxies. You know, this isn't an easy path. If they start to feel like they're getting hurt, they're going to go hard. So it's a pretty dangerous time. But if they do it, if they do that sort of stuff, like they did with Hong Kong, and they might be preparing to do with Taiwan, hopefully, I think it's just going to push allies closer together.
That's interesting in terms of the global scenario. And again, of course, a lot of how economics will flow after situation normalizes. And of course, when it normalizes is something that we don't see it in the horizon at all at this point of time, but we can be hopeful. So I believe that in that sense, you're right in terms of how we are positioning ourselves in India again towards China, and that will probably be a sort of an anchor in terms of at least the Indo-Pacific region, in terms of security and economics in the time to come. And there are a few more questions. I'll take them, and we'll probably take 3 more questions. One question is, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inequality between haves and have-nots. What policy changes should we be expecting globally in this scenario? Would such changes, if any, give more emphasis to socio-economic development, focusing on vulnerable sections of the society? Ulka, you'd like to go first?
Sure, I can try to mention a couple of examples. One is that I think definitely in the development aid sector, among donor agencies, philanthropic organizations, definitely this aspect of bringing the vulnerable population center is becoming even more important than it was before. I think always for this sector, it was important to address issues of livelihood, gender, social equity. But I think coming on the heels of the anti-racism reckoning in the United States, the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the coronavirus crisis, I think together have I think made it non-negotiable almost, if I could put it that way. So certainly. Now, if we even talk about any kinds of interventions that are good for the climate, they cannot be standalone. They have to be very closely tied to the socio-economic, earlier when we would say equity, now we are saying justice. So it's even stronger than before. So that was one thing. The other thing specific example I wanted to make was the example of carbon pricing or carbon taxation, which has sort of ebbed and flowed over the years in terms of the political will behind it. In India, for example, we've been a little reticent to, beyond the coal cess that was imposed a few years ago, but then was swiftly diverted into a GST compensation kind of fund. We've been a little hesitant to really put our, political backing to it. But more and more, there is evidence coming out of how the revenues from a carbon tax have to be recycled in a way that it actually, the welfare impacts are addressed. I think initially when it was first spoken about, the Yellow Vest protests that faced President Macron in, I think it was December of 2018, forced a kind of a quick retreat. But there is, I think, now understanding that if we are serious about the 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement or anything close to it, if you're serious about any kind of climate action, this is a tool, a policy instrument that we need to make use of, but we can't just use it as economics wonks. We have to be very aware of the welfare implications and to design that accordingly. And in countries like ours, where compared to countries like Scandinavia, there isn't that much trust in the government in order to use that recycled revenue well. We have to look for what kinds of measures work best for us. So direct cash transfers would work better than a kind of a collective pool of fund of resources. I'm going to just stop there.
Cleo, you'd like to pitch in to that question as well?
Sure. Well, I think I'm talking just about kind of the kind of like the UK or the US. We're in kind of an interesting situation, at least where economically, where the parties that were traditionally associated with wealth, for example, the Conservative Party in the UK, actually got into power on the backs of of worker voters. In fact, there was the research that came out recently that showed that more middle and lower income people, especially lower income people, supported the Conservatives in the last election than supported the Labour Party. So there's kind of the situation is a little complicated when you conflate kind of perceptions of society and perceptions of wealth. There are a lot of poor white Americans. There are a lot of poor white Brits, and they might be voting for Trump or Boris Johnson out of economic interest, because the political parties that traditionally represented the left are talking about social justice, but may not be delivering the jobs that they want for their families. So it's a complex picture at the moment. And what's happening with the U.S. election, I think, is that the Republicans want to make the election about China, and the Democrats want to make the election about racial equality, social issues, that sort of stuff. So it's very unclear how it'll play out, because if you're saying it's about China, what you're saying is it's about jobs. At least that's how it's perceived. So there is a complexity to definitions around left and right and white and non-white, people of color and African Americans in the U.S. that makes it very difficult to quantify who's going to be supporting whom and what actually will help which groups. It's very tense here. I'm in Miami at the moment, and the situation is unlike anything people have seen. Even people who lived through kind of the race riots in the 60s and social justice movements previously have said they've never seen anything like this. So whether the crisis will deliver real solutions, and in addition to correcting language around historical wrongs and dealing with statues and taking down racist flags and all that sort of stuff, that's unclear.
Okay, thank you. This question is directed to Ulka. What is the state of R&D in India in this field? Assuming this is the green technology field. And how can it be scaled up, besides the fact that investments in this area are still low?
So I think the question doesn't refer to any particular sector or industry.
No, actually, I got this question on my private window, so I thought I'd ask you as well.
Okay, sure. So let me maybe talk about two examples again. One is on the electric vehicles and energy storage. So if you see India's Central Electricity Authority's optimal mix plan for 2030, I think they expect something like 40 gigawatts of energy storage to be created in order to make it possible to use renewable energy in a meaningful way. Um, that's what is called stationary application of energy storage. But then you also have the mobile applications, which is the electric vehicles themselves, which you can charge during the night and use to store, intermittent forms of electricity, and then you can kind of, use those during the day. So that's a mobile application. Now, on the mobile application, internationally, a lot of the R&D has been on four-wheelers, whereas for a country like ours, what we need more of is two-wheelers and three-wheelers, buses as well. So I think there's a lot of R&D that is happening. I think it's a field that I think the private sector is extremely vibrant in this area. But both for reasons of safety in terms of Indian climate conditions, as well as in terms of resource security around our access to minerals, there is definitely a lot of interest in looking at new unconventional battery chemistries. And even the Government of India Department of Science and Technology is driving a lot of the R&D, sort of giving it a boost in partnership with the private sector, of course. So I think it's really exciting times. The other area I want to talk about, which is much more expensive, is this use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which again has been a very kind of almost taboo area of research, because the government of India said that we are okay with doing carbon capture and utilization. For example, there's a plant in Tuticorin which captures carbon and then uses it to make soda bicarbonate. But as far as storage is concerned, until we understand the ecological implications, the long-term ecological implications of storing carbon dioxide, we're not sure we want to really support that. But again, if you look at the IPCC 1.5 scenarios, the only way they are going to be physically possible is if you have carbon capture, utilization, storage, maybe even biomass-based kind of direct, sort of, you need to even go forward towards direct air capture of carbon. So very drastic technologies, very futuristic technologies are required in order to make these scenarios possible. So for sure, there's a lot for India to invest in, or to consider whether it then needs to enter into partnerships with other countries if it doesn't want to do the R&D in-house.
Okay, so this would be the absolute last questions, because there seems to be a lot of questions coming along. So I would pass that on to both the speakers after this question, whichever is there. And I would just read this out. Queries with respect to green curse is gaining more attention in renewable energy sector nowadays. Whether it is an immediate issue in the energy sector. If so, what are the possible measures and policies the green negotiators are taking to tackle this issue?
That's definitely you, Ulka.
Ulka, can you hear me?
I could hear you, but I couldn't hear Cleo. Sorry, what was that? Could you repeat, please,
Go
Vignesh?
ahead.
Okay, the question's for you. Queries with respect to green curse is gaining more attention in renewable energy sector nowadays. So, what are the policies the green negotiators are taking to uh, tackle this issue, basically?
So I'm not very sure I can answer this question really, but the green curse kind of hypothesis is also something that countries like Namibia have really dealt with very well. So it's not something that's a given. I think the idea behind that is, it's like a resource curse, right? Kind of equivalent. So I wouldn't say that that's a given. I think there are, and I wouldn't call it an immediate issue in the energy sector. In terms of measures or policies that green negotiators are taking to tackle this issue, again, I'm really not sure what this refers to, but there is a lot of research that is coming out with emphasis on the job creation aspects of these green sort of sectors, let me put it that way. So the examples that I gave in my presentation were from the energy and transport sectors, but there's actually data from, say, the 2008-2009 American Recovery Act, where the United States, in order to recover from the last economic recession, invested in a number of clean energy and clean transport measures. And if you compare the data over the last decade, you find that dollar for dollar, the renewable energy, building energy efficiency, and public transport investments have yielded more jobs than the equivalent in conventional energy and conventional transport. South Korea is another example of a country that invested 70% of its stimulus for the 2008-2009 crisis in green measures and was the fastest to recover out of the OECD countries. So I wouldn't say that, I mean, that the green hype curse has to be a reality. I think there are definitely a lot of measures that can be taken proactively to achieve both outcomes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for the answering that question. So I'm afraid we're out of time. So what I would do right now is that on your screen, this for the participants, I put out a survey. It helps us in terms of formulating, giving us a feedback in terms of the session and formulating future sessions. So I'll urge you to please take this poll. And in the meantime, let me thank both the speakers, Ulka as well as Cleo. Thank you so much for your insights. It was a really engaging session that we could also see from the polls and the enthusiasm which the participants had. So with this, so on behalf of PRISM, COVINTS, and the Center for Climate Studies at Manipal, I would like to thank Ms. Cleo Paskal and Ulka Kelkar for joining us for this webinar. This brings an end to the second webinar in our series. As a part of the ongoing series, the next topic for the webinar will be on technology, innovation, climate change, and businesses, which will be held on 16 July 2020. And our speakers for this session will be Mr. Jai Kumar Gaurav and Lieutenant Colonel Tushar Ghate. And I hope you will join us for the same. Thank you for all who have attended, and hope you stay safe. And thank you so much, Cleo, and thank you, Ulka, once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
I'll just leave the poll on the screen for a while so that our participants can just take this poll. And to the participants, sorry we couldn't take all your questions because then the session would just go on. I mean, we would love that, but I think we would have to move on, and we'll surely pass on the questions which have not been answered to our speakers, and I'm sure they will answer you, and we'll pass it on to you definitely. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Cleo, and thank you, Ulka. Good night.